What France is doing to Africa is the biggest violation of human rights. Women and children are dying of starvation, youth unemployment, when the same poor countries are giving $500 billion to France. It simply does not make any sense. What really gets me the most is, how does the world sit back and watch this carnage take place in Africa? Where is the United Nations?
This is a small extract from what Arikana Chihombori-Quao said in the video. She exposes shocking details about how France still controls and profits from its former African colonies under the guise of independence, a reality many people have no idea still exists today. Let's watch the rest of the video.
They have significant control over all of their former colonies, specifically 14 of them. Just to give you the highlights of what they did when they were giving the independence, so to speak, to their former colonies. They forced them to sign a document which they are calling the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. You have to understand, on one hand, they are saying we're giving you independence, which turned out to be mostly political independence, but that you also have to sign this document, which is titled the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. So you're going to be independent, but you have to agree to continue to be colonized. So two countries said absolutely not. We are not going to sign those that document.
Those two countries?
Mali and Guinea.
Okay.
And what the French did, they went into those two countries, took everything that they thought they had brought to those two economies, poured concrete into the sewage pipes, and completely devastating the two economies. This was done as a way of letting the other countries know that if you do not sign this document, this is the fate that awaits you. If you look at it, you give up your, the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization said those countries were expected to deposit 85% of their bank reserves back then with the French Central Bank under the control of the French Minister of Finance. And should those countries wish to request some of those monies, because remember they were only left with 15% of their reserves, then they would have to submit a financial statement for the country, and if approved, they could only access up to 20% of whatever they had deposited the year before as a loan at commercial interest rates. The only difference now is the 85% deposits have now been lowered down to maybe between 50 and 60%. But the countries are still forced and required to deposit their bank reserves with the French Central Bank. So picture this situation. You are depositing all your monies with France. Should you need some of your money, you get it as a loan at commercial interest rates. So immediately, you have a credit with France, but you begin to owe France. This has been going on and continues to this day. So combined, the 14 countries are giving to France cash, cold hard cash, over $500 billion every year. And France takes that money and invests it in its own stock market under the French name, and the countries may or may not know the returns. Currently, for every 14 billion that France takes out of Africa, by the time they finish investing it in the French stock market, they are realizing upwards of 300 billion. So you do the math to see how much money France is taking out of Africa every year. And yet France has the audacity to then look at African countries and call them poor countries. Why would poor African countries give $500 billion to France year in and year out? What really gets me the most is, how does the world sit back and watch this carnage take place in Africa? Where is the United Nations? This is the body that's supposed to be looking out for any violations of human rights. It is my humble opinion that singularly, what France is doing to Africa is the biggest violation of human rights. Women and children are dying of starvation, youth unemployment, when the same poor countries are giving $500 billion to France. It simply does not make any sense. And I don't know how the world can sit back and watch all this unfold and nobody is saying anything. It's unacceptable. It is wrong, and we're simply asking France to do what is right, what is just, and what is fair. The Berlin Conference was our colonizers' way of seeing to it that Africa and her children are forever defeated and dominated. They came together in Berlin at the invitation of the then Chancellor of Germany, Bismarck, to divide up Africa.
1891? What was
November 1884 to February of 1885.
Got it.
They met and chopped up Africa into the tiny little economies that we see today. Economies that clearly cannot survive on their own. Economies that are easy to destabilize should they begin to look like they're having a leg up. Economies that will make it very difficult for these countries to trade with each other. You see, economic development is increased productivity from one production cycle to the other. If you interfere with the ability of countries to trade, you immediately mess with economic development. So that partitioning of Africa back in 1884, and those partitionings remain in place today, is responsible for a lot of what has happened in Africa. Our inability to grow our economies, our inability to travel from one country to the other. You look at tourism. If you need to go to Africa and visit 3 different countries, you gotta send your passport to DC 3 different times. And each time your passport comes back, you gotta send it again to another country, 2, 3, 4 weeks before you get your passport back. And then you gotta send it back to Washington. At times, those embassies are on the same street. You could have walked from one embassy to the other, but you can't do it. And by the time you get your passport back with the 3rd visa, the visa for the first country is expired. Who needs to go through all that? So you say, forget it, I'm not going to Africa, I'm going to Europe. At every level, what we see happening today in Africa that affects economic development is directly related to what was done in 1884. You try to go from one part of Africa to the other. It's easier to fly into Europe and then come back down. Why? A lot of the airspaces were closed. All of it thanks to the Berlin Conference. So people don't realize that that decision has everlasting implications on what goes on in Africa. And at the end of the day, it crystallizes down to our failure to grow our economies because it is very expensive to do business from one country to the other. So what we were prior to the Berlin Conference, we were massive, powerful kingdoms. Kingdoms with well-established religious and educational systems. Kingdoms that preceded the Greek civilization, the Roman Empire. If the truth be told, civilization began in Africa. Have you ever wondered why? When they talk about Greek philosophers, the mathematicians, they were sent to Egypt for training, to Egypt for advancement. It's because Africa already had it. The pyramids, the Zimbabwe ruins, they were there over 2,500 years before the Greek civilization, 2,500 years before the Roman Empire. It all started in Africa. That's part of the history that was cut out, and they set out to get us to forget that life as we know it began in Africa. Civilization as we know it began in Africa. The Europeans stole it from us. All of Africa could come together if the entire continent could come together. But our reality is, because of the stronghold that France has on Africa, France can destabilize any of its former colonies with the push of a button. So the reality is, trying to push back against France is mission impossible at this time, which is why we are very pleased that finally the African heads of states were able to come together and agreed on what we are calling the African Continental Free Trade Area. You got to understand, back in 1963, when our Pan-African leaders came together and created the Organization of African Unity, they were trying to undo the damage done by the Berlin Conference. But unfortunately, when they went to Addis Ababa, they were divided. We had the Casablanca group, who were Ghana, Guinea, Mali, Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. They were outnumbered by the others, who were the nationalists, who said, let's go slow. The Casablanca group who said, Africa for the Africans, at home and abroad, African Union now. Had we won, had the Casablanca group won in 1963, Africa would be in a very different place because all these borders would have been eliminated back then. They came up with a compromise, which we are calling Organization of African Unity. Year in, year out, for 55 years. The African heads of states met. The issue of an Africa speaking with one voice, one continent, one Africa was tabled. And year in and year out, we failed to reach consensus until last year, March 2018, when they finally agreed that enough is enough. Africa must speak with one voice. Africa must enter the world stage as one customs union, as one continent, speaking with one voice. That is the only way that Africa can begin to take her rightful place on the world stage.
What do you think about what Arikana just revealed? Should Africa continue tolerating this kind of exploitation, or is it time to take a stand once and for all? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more eye-opening content. Watch this video next, I'm sure you will love it.